So this is a session on case studies and records management. Our presenter for this session is Matt Brown. He works at the Oregon State Archives as the program administrator of the Oregon's Records Management Solution, a unique cloud computing program available to government agencies. ORMS customers see benefits from increased efficiency, automation of records retention and destruction, enhanced records security, and optional web publication of selected documents. In addition to the ORMS, Matt frequently presents on topics related to records disaster preparedness and recovery. His past work experience includes the Federal Reserve Board, International Monetary Fund, and Maryland State Archives. Matt is a certified records management and holds a master's degree in library science and an MA in history, both from the University of Maryland at College Park. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Matt, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Pleased to be with you. My name is Matt. I work for the Oregon State Archives. I work for Chris Denson at the Oregon State Archives, the previous presenter. So we work closely on a lot of these topics, and he held my position before I did. So great to have him as a resource. So Oregon State Archives, we're really grateful that we were asked by Wyoming State Archives to join this. Our own cloud computing solution 10-year anniversary came and went during the pandemic. We did not observe it or celebrate it in any way. So it's nice to be able to talk to you today and share our experience. The main case study is going to be ORMS, Oregon Records Management Solution. But we have plenty of expertise with traditional records management. And so some of those topics that relate to ORMS are going to pop up a few times. So Secretary of State, where I work, is the public records administrator for the state of Oregon, sets retention schedules, sets best practices. We give advice and assistance on requests to Oregon agencies, over 5,000 of them at last count. Our archives had an early interest in electronic records management, but it took at least two hardworking state archivists succeeded by each other to finally get the funding for it and to implement it. And so that started around 2006. I've been at the archive since 2004. So I have plenty of experience with some interesting office visits, such as this one. We call these the before times. We moved past that at our agency around 2008, and we're really glad we did. Now that software and best practices include records management software that can automate a lot of this, there's no need to have although it's tough to go paperless, you can make a large dent in it. So I just really like that photo. It reminds me of the early days. So our archives, we're all into records management, especially electronic records and information management. Everything I say today is from the Oregon perspective. You might think it's a little bit different in my state, and that's very possible. If you have questions, it's best to ask the authority in your state. If you're from Wyoming, definitely ask Sarah, Cindy, Stephanie, and the folks there will be able to assist you. So I will leave time at the end for questions, and we'll see if I stick to the time frame here. So let's get rolling. So back in the early days, we were called to assist agencies with their annual shred days, collection days. Those kind of morphed into electronic records to include electronic records deletion as well. That's a little tougher. We would be there to offer assistance. We've pretty much seen it all. We took photos of the best stuff, keeping the name of the agency responsible redacted. I once visited a city in Oregon that had all of its paper records stored in a metal shipping container out back of City Hall. And as you can imagine, those are not watertight, and it was pretty messy. Luckily, that agency has seen the light. They've moved toward electronic records management. Sometimes with permission of the agencies we visited, we would take photographs. I always made me wonder about this photo with this office. This person had all these chairs in their office, but there was still nowhere to sit because they worked in the planning department and they just had planning maps and reports, printed out emails on every available surface. So not something that we look back at it and we're glad we're not in that environment anymore, that we have options. Okay. When agencies decide to, go paperless or have less paper, oftentimes they gravitate towards network drives, shared drives. At one point, those were a perfectly fine solution. But for those of you that employ network drives to manage public records, you're probably aware of a lot of the limitations. First of all, network drives are not designed for records management purposes, or really for that matter, for search and retrieval. So I also want you to keep in mind subpoenas, e-discovery, litigation requests, or even just public records requests that your agency or company has received. Was it easy to fill those requests? Was it tedious? Did it involve a lot of extra time and effort? So these are some of the business challenges that can lead agencies to move from analog paper microfilm solutions toward electronic records management solutions. The volume is constantly growing. It's basically too much stuff for even teams of individuals dedicated to records management to keep up with. And the volume only grows year after year. Silos of information, that was something State Archives was well aware of in our own file management before we went to ORMS. Each department tended to have its own network drive. And if you needed something that another department was working on, you were usually out of luck. Sometimes someone would share it with you, but it just meant people were locked out of if needed information and they couldn't get to it because they lacked access rights and the network wasn't set up to allow that. Or even if just someone was out sick and they happened to have the file copy on a drive we couldn't access, then we were locked. We couldn't get to that information until they got back to the office and could share it with us. So it's these kinds of inefficiencies and other work processes that electronic records management solutions can go a long way towards automating. Also, records security. Network drives don't have a great way of managing it in a granular way. I mean, you can certainly have an IT person there whose job it is to change security access controls on individual documents, but nobody really wants to have to do that. They weren't designed for that, and it can be tedious to make that happen. So keep it rolling with some of the other issues that you can run into when you're managing a network drive. Records retention. In the public sector, records retention schedules tell us how long to keep our records. And that can be difficult to do in a network shared drive environment where it's not possible to apply retention policies. The kind of thing Chris Stenson was talking about when it comes to Teams and email. So complying with security retention requirements, while not impossible, tended to be very time consuming and also arduous. People didn't want to have to do it. It just took way too much time away from the core duties they were evaluated on. Were they fulfilling their core duties? And providing access to public records tended, to be on the back burner, if anywhere. So the result of all of these things when it comes to network drives was way too much legal liability for the agency in question. When you chose to cut corners, destroy records before their retention schedule allowed it, then you could be caught and you could be fined, held in contempt of court because you weren't in compliance with these statutes and regulations that told you how long to keep certain documents. If you threw up your hands and said, we're just going to keep everything forever, that leads to a different type of liability, which is you're constantly spending way too much money on extra servers and IT expertise to manage this growing mountain of records. You also find yourself out of compliance with retention rules. If it says you can keep it after 1 year and you've got the last 50 years, and we've run into agencies following that records hoarding approach, then they're out of compliance. They should have destroyed records. They're misusing public resources, and they should be destroying documents when their retention schedule says that they can. So what are some possible solutions? And let's see, I got way off track here. Possible solutions. What do you want a records management solution to do for you? Well, you want to avoid all those pitfalls of network drives. You really want to centralize your control, your intellectual control of your important public records trusted to your care. You don't want to have them in an offsite storage warehouse and an electronic vault and in file cabinets scattered around your office, and also in databases, emails, and other IT systems. The preference is that you want to have a single records repository. And when you're requested for information, it manages retention and security, serves access to those who have rights, manages it automatically for retention purposes, and allows access and retrieval in a simplified way. You want to eliminate unnecessary duplication. The example for my agency is there's about 25 of us. When there's an all staff email, there's 25 copies in Outlook boxes, right? And so we only want to keep the one official copy designated by our policy, and our policy is the sender of an email keeps the official copy and manages it according to retention rules, placing it in ORMS. The other 24 copies are considered duplicates that must be destroyed. When you absorb that information and you act on it or not, but you know you don't have the official copy, and duplicates should be destroyed. So that prevents individuals from squirreling away extra copies of documents to their own preferred places on drives so that they can get to them later. That creates all kinds of issues with version control. And when an official copy is destroyed and people have their own duplicate copies laying elsewhere, then those become the official copy. And again, subject to public records rules and also disclosure. If it exists, it must be disclosed. So we want a solution that's going to help us simplify our routine tasks and free us up to spend our time on our mission critical duties rather than on routine ones. We want to automate retention and security. That means keeping audit trails. More on that in a minute. We'd like to reclaim office space that is used for document storage. As in that previous slide, we saw just piles and piles of documents on top of file cabinets. We'd love to simplify the removal of non-essential documents. If it's not a public record to begin with, and it happens to be in the system, to have a simple way to get that out of there. For records that have met their destruction periods, retention periods, to be destroyed in an automated way. And we also want a solution that allows interdepartmental collaboration, manage document versions, retain the different revisions or versions together in the system. There's nothing that says drafts and working papers can't be requested by the public in a public records requests or litigation. In a lot of cases, those drafts are subject to disclosure, and you need a system that's going to keep those previous revisions just as along with the final version. All right, so talking today purely about Oregon's use of Content Manager, which will differ from how Wyoming uses it somewhat. We use it to reply to records requests. We have had 8 different Secretary of State administrations in the last 11 years. And so at each transition, there tends to be a flood of records requests for those records related to, at the end of the term, the transition. We also get plenty of subpoenas and litigation requests. And ORMS is our central public records repository for complying with those. Aside from the disclosure, we use it to comply with records management. All our records retention schedules we load them into the system. As a state agency, we load the state agency retention schedule and the Secretary of State special schedule into our instance of Content Manager or ORMS, meaning people don't have to, they basically just pick and choose from a list to classify their documents. They don't need to become experts on the retention schedule. All 220 of us at Secretary of State have copies of Content Manager loaded on our machines, and we're expected to use it. This provides uninterrupted access to business information. If you have a business need to see it, you will be able to get to it. And even if you don't have the rights, you can request that through channels at our agency. And then finally, we use ORMS as our primary disaster recovery solution. It is a solution as a service, a SaaS cloud computing secure government cloud, which we rely on. If anything ever happened to our offices, we would be able to relocate purely from the backups at our data center. But like I said, I will talk a little bit more about disaster preparedness and recovery on a future slide. But let's talk a little bit about where we came from. It's a secure cloud solution. It's a public-private partnership with Shavs Consulting in Baker City, Oregon, and it's available to all Oregon government agencies. It's kind of a unique model that's been honed over the years. We build it up through constant improvement process over the course of 3 different state archivists. Since around 2007, I think is when the earliest search began. 2008, we ended up looking at a whole bunch of solutions, kicked the tires on a bunch, there was a bunch of travel to check out how agencies were using this pretty fledgling software. It wasn't in use a lot of places. For the due diligence portion in 2009, the solution was selected. It was then called HP Trim, and some of us old timers still refer to it as Trim, no matter what the manufacturer thinks of it as. And in 2009 also began our standalone Secretary of State implementation, not cloud-based. That wasn't really a thing. What we did was went out and acquired the software licenses ourselves, the hardware. We brought in experts and implementers to teach us the software so that we could then teach others. The following year, that was ended, and we began the public-private partnership with Shavs that continues to this day. It began as a project in the pilot phase with a limited number of agencies. 3 years later, it was approved as a statewide program, entered the program phase. And in 2016, after several name changes, the underlying software hasn't changed that much, but its corporate masters have decided to rebrand it a number of times. 2016 was when it began to be called Content Manager, and that's what we still call it today. It was years from our earliest desires to get something like this before the software industry caught up with what we were trying to do and provided these kinds of electronic records management solutions on the market. And since then, since around this time, 2010 roughly, ERMS systems have become an industry best practice. The old days of managing paper, microfilm, analog has become, while still in practice by a lot of agencies, we strongly recommend that they consider solutions such as this. It can save them a lot of time and a lot of money. All right, so Department of Defense standards is one of the primary electronic records management software standards. It requires security, authenticity, and integrity of records management applications. We lack the resources here in Oregon to do anything like their certification process. We're happy to piggyback off their standard, and it's even in our Oregon administrative rules. There's no requirement for any Oregon agency to go out and buy an ORMS system. But if it does buy one, it can't just purchase one because it's cheap before, or because someone else uses it. It has to be listed on the Department of Defense standard 5015. So you may only acquire a compliant solution that appears on that list. There are customized security settings, and that's something State Archives does behind the scenes. Group-based security for the most part, to assign individuals and teams the proper security and access controls. State Archives also builds in those retention schedules into each instance for each customer. And audit trails are recorded automatically, and that gives the agency transparency and accountability. There's a permanent record of all actions performed in the system. All right, one of my favorite topics, disaster recovery. As a cloud-based solution, we're able to store our data and records roughly 300 miles away on the other side of the Cascade Mountains at the Synergy Data Center, which is a tier 3 data center. That means it has multiple paths for power and cooling and systems in place to update and maintain the servers without taking it offline. So no systems uptime is 100%, but this is pretty close. It's 99.98% uptime. It's never been hacked and never been breached. It is on a dual power grid. Luckily, if it's operating on the Idaho power grid, which is affected by weather or something else, it can switch over to the Oregon power grid, and agencies do not lose even temporary. They have continual access to their information in the system, and it's meant to serve information to authorize users via the cloud. So basically just an internet connection, as long as they comply with our security protocols. I covered some of this already. Records retention periods when reached. Records will become eligible for destruction, preferably with not a lot of user intervention required. Meaning, in the old days, someone would have to go through a file cabinet, look at each document, determine whether it met its retention period, and either leave it or pull it out for destruction. In this case, an agency merely asks State Archives to send a list of records in ORMS eligible for destruction. And for us, that's as simple as running a search. We generate a spreadsheet with enough metadata that they can get a sense for the document. And then plenty of dates. The system keeps track of all kinds of dates so that they can determine whether they should sign off on some or all of the records in that list. Chris Denson mentioned during his presentation the importance of legal holds. ORMS also has legal holds that temporarily freeze the destruction of records, even if their retention period has been met, if there is an ongoing legal matter or even anticipated litigation. You can place legal holds on any documents in the system. So it also includes audit logs. Even after destruction, your metadata is going to be kept in the system. retained permanently. It holds up in court. Let's say when a journalist wants to know why an agency is not disclosing certain documents, you can point to your audit logs and say, we held it, it had a retention period of 5 years. When it was at 5 years, you can see that it was destroyed as of that date in compliance with our records retention schedule. So while the image of the document itself is no longer there, all the metadata pertaining to that document will be retained permanently. Our logo here, it's a solution as a service because it's not just the software. You don't just log into it and then you're on your own. It includes other services such as loading of retention, building of security groups, training resources provided. ORMS has been added to the state contract. So to acquire it, our Oregon agencies don't have to go to RFP. And it saves you what SOS went through, which was paying upfront for the hardware, the software, the upgrades, the maintenance. It's a per user per month fee that includes subscription services, which we'll talk about in a second. And Content Manager and ORMS also comply with provisions of, sorry for the alphabet soup, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, Medical, Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, Student Records, and Criminal Justice and Information Systems, CJIS, background checks, criminal justice information, stuff like that. So it also complies with the Oregon administrative rules. So a basic sense for what is included in the subscription services that agencies pay a monthly fee. Well, there's the setup, the implementation. We meet with agencies up front to get a sense for what they want to do. And then we build it that way for them. We provide access to training library that includes videos and step-by-step guidance documents. Access to our support desk and the ORMS teams that all work in tandem with them. State Archives normally begins initial folder structure and builds security and retention rules on those folders, leaving the agency itself the training resources to populate documents in those folder structures. The subscription services come with gigabyte allocation per user, which is cumulative across the agency. And our ORMS, since we had a bulk license purchase, it helps ensure a direct line to the manufacturer when they're considering changes to the software company. Our methods also allow the import and migration of documents along with metadata. A redaction module in case you want to, black out a social security number before you send it out. And then I should mention the software version upgrades are complimentary. When ORMS upgrades, we all leap at once, and all the customers come along with us for the ride. Got ahead of myself. Some things that aren't included in this monthly subscription services, basically scanning, including metadata entry. We do have some scanning vendor partners that have worked for dozens of our agencies. And we've had customers use all of these following additional services, some through ORMS, but they're free to get them from other parties as well. The scanning doesn't have to be done by a vendor. It can be done in-house as well, typically with the scanners and copiers that they have on hand. Software integrations, in some cases APIs. We only add on to, there's only a non-subscription service additional fee if custom programming by the ORMS technical team is necessary. There have been plenty of cases where agencies moved from legacy software systems and basically were able to do it themselves. They exported the documents out of the old system and then imported them into ORMS. Other types of services that are possible include workflows. For example, kick off an auto-generated notification when it's your turn to perform work or sign a document, something like that. Data capture forms, including zonal optical character recognition, OCR. If you have 1,000 copies of the same template form, you can spin those in there and it will pick out from each zone like the name, and it will generate that into a form. Retroactive OCR isn't currently a feature offered within ORMS. If you want your documents to be full text searchable when you put them in, that optical character recognition needs to be performed at the time that the document is imported into the system. Continue with other additional services that are available, but not part of subscription services. Geolocations, it's a pay-as-you-go model. It requires a purchase license key to allow GPS coordinates searches within the system. And then finally, auto classification, a machine language tool that you point at a data store and it will separate invoices into one folder and then auto classify documents, basically. And Secretary of State is working hard to acquire this kind of tool. So I mentioned that our version is probably going to look different from Wyoming's, and partly is that because we're on slightly different software versions at the moment. Maybe one of these days we'll sync up. But this just shows you a little bit of the folder structure of Content Manager. When you see these folders, the color codes tell you what level you're at. You can see this 2023 invoices folder has multiple document types, PDF, Word, and a text document, all there because it will accept something like 400 different file extensions, file formats. That highlighted document, it kind of microscopes down in the display at the bottom. It shows you detailed metadata about the highlighted document. So you can have it as much metadata or an uncluttered minimalist version as you want. Just the metadata helps people decide whether this is the document they're looking for or not. So there's certainly been some bumps over the years. It's evolved. ORMS has evolved quite a bit. There's been over the long term a steady increase in customers and agencies. Back when we started 2008, 2009 was a very interesting time due to the Great Recession going on. I think our budget was approved just before that hit, so very grateful for that. A lot of entities these days lack the resources to acquire this kind of solution on their own. They would not be able to afford it if they weren't kind of buying off our licensed store. Even our agency with our budget seriously struggled with the finances and the time limitations to stand it up on our own. We lacked in-house technical knowledge, so we had to pay others to do that. And we were also kind of starting a model that no one had done before, so there wasn't really anyone we could ask for help. So other growing pains, I would say we had an idea who our original customer base would be, and that turned out not to be. We thought it would be a handful of large state agencies. And when we do have a number of state agencies, our customer base is mostly smaller agencies, school districts, rural cities that would not be able to get this other kind of best practice otherwise, and to help them practice consistent records management. And they also want it to be scalable, and this is an extremely scalable solution. There's also been, as I mentioned, a bunch of different corporate acquisitions over the years and the associated rebranding. For us, that basically means we have to call it something else, and we sometimes have to recreate our training materials to keep up with the latest version. But for the most part, that happens every couple of years. It's to be expected, really, in any technology project. One thing that wasn't a growing pain was this having a pre-existing cloud computing solution in place before the pandemic meant we had a very smooth transition to the hybrid work environment that we find ourselves in today. And if you're familiar with Oregon, you know, our population base is a lot is west of the mountains. These kind of follow population centers, Portland, Salem, Eugene, but there's plenty of our other customers that have seen the benefit for it outside the urban centers and continues to grow. So I do want to talk to you about a couple of quick case studies, success stories. We had a school district that got into ORMS because they were awash in paper. They had 10 different building locations, 10 different schools, documents scored in all the different schools, and just decades and decades of unmanaged paper and digital records. The variety of formats, I'm talking about large paper bound books, the old timey ones with large bindings, loose records that weren't even in folders, microfilm, things like that. Our student transcripts have extremely long retention periods, and they wanted to be able to get a handle on that. So 3-year project, collaboration with us to import their student records into ORMS. Nowadays, they have 25 years worth of board documents, special education, cumulative records going back 29 years, and 75 years of student transcripts. And they don't just have this work done, they have a standard procedure for rolling it into the future. And in the physical sense, they were able to clear out large swaths of their office space. They previously had 2 very large records vaults emptied and converted to office space. When they completed the project, they were able to fill and shred 135 of those big 55-gallon paper bins. And the remaining paper records that weren't destroyed fit in a single fairly small location, record storage area. So they got that office space back and they were able to reallocate it. Another case study was from a state agency. It's our Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. And on-site septic permits were required to be on file in paper at branch offices. Nobody really liked that. They chose to digitize that through us and our trusted scanning vendor. So they started out with 100,000 documents, and that meant documents loaded on trucks, sent to Portland, scanned, and then after quality control, many of them were destroyed. There was no reason to keep all those. So they got the office space back. As you can imagine, 100,000 documents in 6 branch offices was really a success. It's now over 120,000 documents because they continue to add not just the legacy, but the ongoing work into it. And that led Oregon DEQ to expand to about a dozen other programs at their agency. And some of these new projects are dwarfing the size of this one even. So that eliminated a lot of the time that the agency had to spend responding to public records requests from homeowners or realtors that needed those septic permits to complete a sale. And it means the public doesn't have to leave their house. They can go to the internet site. Anyone with an internet connection can search and retrieve and pull up septic permits statewide. And another DEQ agency reported that they spend only half what they used to on the purchase of paper. That's for their office operations. That's the end of the chat about ORMS. I did, just to get a little conversation going, we get asked quite a bit, to anticipate things in records management, what tends to drive requests for the advice that we get. And it's not going to be any earth-shaking advice to you on this call, I'm sure, but these have been constant in my entire 19 years with state archives. People call us when they've been told they're going to move offices. especially when they're moving to a building with a smaller footprint. That seems to be the trend. They know they have less dedicated storage space, and they need to figure something out. And often that means going paperless. Other agencies tend to call us when there are negative stories in the newspaper regarding their ability to disclose records or to keep records. And so that's been ever since I've started. But nowadays, we get requests because there's been good word of mouth about what ORMS does, what Content Manager can do to save time and money in these times of restricted budgets, and to increase efficiency. But I'm happy to take, other if I've left anything out, because those can be the kinds of things that people want to think about in advance, to know when they're going to be asked by people about, get extra volume of questions about those kinds of things. And then I know this gets asked in a variety of ways. Is our agency allowed to go paperless? So for those of you from Oregon, the answer is yes, with conditions, and check with state archives if you're unsure. There are Oregon administrative rule provisions that you need to comply with. But the answer for basically every type of document, regardless of retention period, is yes, it is possible to go paperless and to dispose of the original document, paper, microfilm, after it's been digitized according to the Oregon administrative rules. But again, ask the authority in your state if you have questions about how that works in your state. And I see we're at 2:45. I'm happy to take any questions at this time.
All right, I think we have a question from Glenn. He's asking if you have any understanding on why the larger agencies haven't bought into ORMS.
Yeah, it's a question we spend time thinking about. And while we do have, as I mentioned, Oregon DEQ is one of our largest state agencies, is pretty much all in on it. There are a number of others that they might have their own preferred software solution. But like I said, there's no requirement for anyone to get ORMS. There's other options. Most of the larger state agencies do have some sort of electronic management system, but a lot of them really don't have ERMS at this point. And that's something we continue to work with them on. We, and partly it's education, getting people to, move out of their comfort zone, to realize we don't have to keep doing it the way we always have, and that there are efficiencies to be found there. So yeah, we know we're going to have, while a lot of the growth lately has been with smaller entities that wouldn't be able to afford it otherwise, we are moving into other larger state agencies that once they hear the experience of some of their colleagues in state government, they tend to call us and want to find out. But yeah, it's something we're really interested in finding out about. And I was a little surprised when I heard about the numbers for school districts, smaller cities, rural counties being a main driver. So a large number of agencies with smaller numbers of users at each agency. I appreciate the question.
Great. I have another question. It was asking, do you find that you are constantly needing to retrain offices, and how do you handle that?
Yeah, it's a good question. In the last 2 years, we went from State Archives trains all users on requests as many times as requested, to more of a train the trainer model. And so now with today's new agencies, we'll ask them to select multiple agency trainers, because they're going to be kind of the internal champions. And also they understand the agency and the culture and the records themselves way better than we do. Our knowledge is an inch thick and a mile, mile wide and an inch deep. We don't really know how people accomplish their work or the way they prefer to work in the way that internal employees do. So we spend our training time with those trainers and load them up with strategies for imparting information to the end users, the folks that will be creating folders, adding documents to folders, retrieving documents, the basic functions. But there's a big difference between knowing the functions yourself and having a good strategy for teaching other people that. And so that's something that we work on a bit. We have had some agencies that do come back for more training, and that's one of the reasons that we came up with our training video resources and our training guidance documents, because a lot of times the questions are just simply about where do I drag and drop, what are my options for adding documents, things that are easily covered in short 3 to 5 minute videos or guidance documents that walk people through the steps for doing those things. So if there's simple questions like that, it's usually it gets handled by those kinds of resources. For folks that they got trained and then they didn't touch it for a year, they may as well need a complete retraining, and that's
Oh yeah.
Strategize. I know it's just like me. If I get some new piece of software and I don't use it that week, then forget it. It's in one ear, out the other. So I get it. But yeah, we do spend some time working on that, and we're always looking to improve our on the phone or screen share strategies, as well as our recorded training resources.
Fantastic. Do we have any other questions for Matt? Okay, so I am not seeing any other questions at this time for Matt, but luckily you have some time to come up with more questions. Matt will be joining us for the next session. And also you can always reach out to him at a later time. Matt's information is available on this slide, and we can reach out to him using that information.